Assalamualaikum to Sir Farhan. We are from Group 6 and today we want to present about Chapter 6, which is Theoretical Framework and Hypothesis Development. Theoretical framework is needed when we want to understand why something happened, like customer complaint or high staff turnover. It's also used to study the impact of a project, policy or program. The purpose is to show how the variable related, explain why they are related, and clearly present the cause and effect. There are two research approaches, which is deductive and exploratory or descriptive. Deductive means testing a theory through hypothesis, while exploratory or descriptive does not need any hypothesis. It's more about discovering ideas. A theoretical framework shows what we believe is happening and why. It's based on two things. Number one is past research, and number two is finding from early studies. It helps our research structure, direction, and meaning. Next, there are three main steps to building a theoretical framework. Number one is define the variables, clearly explain what each one means. Number two is create a model by showing how this variable is connected. And number three is explain the theory by describe why this relationship matter. This helps us understand the logic behind our research and support our study. I will pass to the next presenter.
Four main types of variable. First, dependent variable. Outcome that influenced by other variable, which is, and in other words, in the main variable that lives in self for investigation from a pragmatic point of view. Is where the problem lies. For instance, if we were interested in investigating the problem of staff turnover, our dependent variable will be staff turnover. For this purpose, the researcher will be interested in quantifying and measuring the independent variable as well as the other variable that influence this variable. Second, independent variable, factor that influences the independent variable. Does it when the independent variable is present, the dependent variable is also present, and with each unit of increase in the independent variable, there is an increase of the decrease in the dependent variable. In other words, the variation in the dependent variable is accounted for by variation in the independent variable. 3. Moderating variable affect the strength of the relationship between independent and dependent variable. The moderating variable is one that has contingent effect on the independent variable dependent variable relationship. Does it the presence of a third variable? The moderating variable modifies the original relationship between the independent and independent variable. As in the both case, wherever the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable becomes contingent of dependent on another variable, we say that the third variable has a moderating effect on the independent variable dependent variable relationship. 4. Mediating variable explain the relationship between independent and dependent variable. There is a temporal quality of time dimension to the mediating variable. In other words, bringing a mediating variable into play helps you to model a process. The mediating variable surfaces as a function of the independent variable operating in any situation and helps to conceptualize and explain the influence of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Relationship among variable. Understanding relationship among variable helps in hypothesis formulation. For example, employee training, performance may be influenced by appearance or motivations. The independent variable help to explain the variance in the independent variable. The mediating variable surface at time t2 as a function of the independent variable, which also help us to conceptualize the relationship between the independent and which also help us to conceptualize the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. And two moderating variable has a contingent effect on relationship between two variables. To put it differently, while the independent variable is plain, the variance in the dependent variable, the mediation variable, does not add to the variance already. For instance, a variable such as motivation to work could be a dependent variable as independent variable, a dominating variable, or moderating variable, depending on the theoretical model that is being advanced. I will pass to next presenter.
Hi Asmeko, my name is Izati and I will be presenting this slide. How theory is generated. Theory is created through a step-by-step process that begins with identifying a specific problem. This problem known as the dependent variable, which is what the researcher wants to understand or solve. To begin, the researcher conducts a literature review, which involves studying previous research to see what is already known about the problem. This helps identify important factors that may be linked to the issue. In addition to the literature review, the researcher also carries out qualitative research such as interviews, observations, or analyzing documents. This helps gain a deeper understanding of the real life context and adds detail that written study may not cover. With this information, the researcher can list the variable involved. First, the main problem, which we call dependent variable, possible causes, which is independent variables, and other factors that might influence or explain the relationship, which is moderating or mediating variables. Once these variables are clear, the researcher builds a theoretical framework. This framework is like a visual or written model that shows how the variables are connected. From this, the researcher developed testable statements known as hypotheses that predict how the variables affect one another. Finally, these hypotheses are tested using data. The results show whether the theory is correct, partially correct, or needs to be revised. In this way, theory is not just guessed, it is built, tested, and improved based on evidence. The result of hypothesis testing provide the researcher with information on whether and to what extent different interventions contribute on solving the problem. Next is component of theoretical framework. Every good theoretical framework includes three basic parts. First, it must clearly define the important variables in the study. These are the key concepts that you're focusing on, like brand image, customer satisfaction, or service quality. By defining clearly, you make it easier to understand what you are studying on how you plan to measure this concept later in your research. Second, the framework should include a conceptual model. This is like a visual map that shows how the variables are connected. For example, you might think that a good brand image leads to a higher customer satisfaction. The conceptual model helps organize your thinking and also shows the reader how you believe the variables influence one another. Third, the framework should offer a clear explanation of why you believe the variables are connected. This is why you explain your reasoning or refer to the earlier studies that support your ideas. You should also say whether you expect the relationship to be positive or negative. Once these parts are in place, you can create hypotheses and that can be tested with real data to see if your theory is valid. It's important to understand that you don't always need to invent a new theory from scratch. In most practical research, you apply existing theories to a new situation using ideas and evidence from past research. But if you're doing more original research, you may need to contribute something new. I will pass to the next presenter. Dun, dun.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I, Maisara Alia binti Muhammad Baharum, will continue with our group presentation on definition of a hypothesis. So before we jump into the definition of a hypothesis, we will delve into the hypothesis development. Alright, so hypothesis development begins after identifying the relevant variables and establishing logical relationships within a theoretical framework. It involves testing this relationship whether in fact it is true or not through appropriate statistical analysis, which is quantitative, or negative case analysis, which is for qualitative. This process is able to obtain reliable information on what kinds of relationships exist among the variables operating in the problem situation, as this will lead to reliable insights and finding potential solutions or what can be changed in the situation as the findings offer guidance. Next is a definition of a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a tentative yet testable statement that predicts expected outcomes in empirical data. It is derived from the theory used in the conceptual model. It is grounded in theoretical foundations and usually involves relationships between the variables, as it typically describes the relationship involved between two or more variables. These hypotheses serve as a tool for solutions to solve the encounter research problems, as it helps to confirm or refute the predicted relationship. Moving on to the purpose of hypothesis testing. Testing hypotheses help establish whether statistically significant relationships exist among the variables. The hypothesis is confirmed if a positive correlation is found through statistical analysis by measuring both variables and checking for statistical correlation. To call a relationship statistically significant, the significance level needs to be confident at 95 times out of 100. The observed relationship will hold true, with only a 5% chance of error or not detected. Last but not least is the statements of hypothesis formats. There is two format, which is first if then format, and the second one is two-part statement format. As you can see on the slide, you can basically look at their differences in the example given. So first, for if then format, the example is if young women are more frequently exposed to thin models, then they will be more likely to express dissatisfaction with their body weight. For the second format, which is two-part statement format, the example is young women will be more likely to express dissatisfaction with their body weight when frequently exposed to thin models. So I think that's all from me. I will pass to the next presenter.
On this slide, I'll be explaining the difference between directional and non-directional hypotheses. A directional hypothesis specifies the expected direction of the relationship or difference between variables. This means that when we state a directional hypothesis, we are predicting not just a relationship exists, but also how it will occur. For example, we might say that increased study time leads to higher exam scores, which indicates a positive relationship. Directional hypotheses use terms like positive, negative, more than, or less than. On the other hand, a non-directional hypothesis simply states that a relationship or difference exists between variables, but it does not specify the direction of this relationship. In other words, we expect a significant relationship or difference, but we don't expect whether it will be positive or negative, or which group will be higher or lower. For example, we might say there is a difference in exam scores between students who study and those who do not, without stating which group scores higher. Let's move on to the concept of null and alternate hypothesis. A null hypothesis assumes that any observed effect or difference is due to random chance and not a real effect. It is usually a statement of no difference or no relationship. For example, we might say there is no difference in exam scores between students who study and those who do not. In hypothesis testing, our goal is often to reject the null hypothesis to provide support for the alternate hypothesis. The alternate hypothesis usually denoted as H1, is the research prediction or assumption that a relationship or effect actually exists between variables. This is the hypothesis we aim to support through empirical testing. For instance, students who study have different exam scores compared to those who do not, or more specifically, students who study scored higher on exams.
Hello everyone, my name is Muhammad Hadif Kalisha bin Romli. So I will be sharing an example of how we can develop a theoretical framework using a real-world issue, in this case, why women are still underrepresented in top management roles. Even though more and more women are joining the workforce and entering management positions, very few actually make it to the top. This shows that the glass ceiling still exists in many organizations. Based on past research, there are two key reasons that keep coming up: gender role stereotypes and limited access to important information. Let's break that down a bit more. Because of gender stereotypes, women are often placed in support roles instead of leadership tracks. These roles don't involve decision making or budget control, both of which are essential if you want to move up the ladder. At the same time, women are often left out of informal networks like golf outings or casual meetups, where a lot of important information is shared. Without this access, they miss out on key opportunities, not because they are not qualified, but because they are simply not in the loop. So to wrap up, we can see that both stereotypes and a lack of access to information quietly hold women back from reaching leadership positions. Using a theoretical framework helps us connect these issues and understand how they influence one another. It also allows researchers and hopefully organizations to develop better strategies that support women and create a more equal workplace.